You're listening to episode 326 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dave Smith joins us to speak about his Secular Dharma Foundation. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the Contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. I also want to thank our friend Anthony Dominello of Structure from Sound for lending his talent and skill to this and my other podcast. Anthony has donated hours of work every week for years now, and I'm so grateful for his dedication and wish him the very best as he moves on to other projects. Whether you find a secular approach to Buddha's teaching a wonderful innovation or a turn for the worst, it is nonetheless here and growing as Buddhism finds its place in an increasingly secular society. New ways of teaching and practice continue to show up, and despite some voices to the contrary, there's some really good teachers and content available. Dave Smith is an internationally recognized Buddhist meditation teacher, addiction treatment specialist, experienced speaker, and published author. His background is rooted in the Insight meditation tradition, and he was empowered to teach through Against the Stream Buddhist Meditation Society and has received training in Buddhist psychology from the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies. He has extensive experience bringing meditative interventions into jails, prisons, youth detention centers, and addiction treatment facilities. Dave teaches residential meditation retreats and classes, provides workshops, trainings, and consulting in both secular and Buddhist contexts, and works with students through his meditation mentoring program. He recently founded the Secular Dharma Foundation and lives in Colorado. So sit back, relax, and have a nice ginger mint tea. Our guest today returning is my old friend Dave Smith. Dave, welcome back. Good to see you.
You too, Ted. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah. So it's been a while, and there have been some moves with you. We've been shifting around a little bit, even though, as we were just reflecting before starting recording, you've already been where you are for a couple of years now. So been some changes. Why don't you catch up the listeners on what you've been doing?
Okay, yeah, I could do that. I think the last time we spoke about my ebook, Ethical Mindfulness, and I had just moved to Los Angeles at that point. That must have been, God, going on 4 or 5 years now. So I lived in Los Angeles for a little while, and I was working with Against the Stream and Refuge Recovery, and was a big part of that community for a while, as you know. My time in LA I moved there very reluctantly. I kind of moved there because it was the best sort of bad choice at the time. I never wanted to really live in Los Angeles, but and also a whole another side story is I got in a really bad motorcycle accident while I was in Los Angeles, and I almost died. So that could probably be a whole nother podcast, but I had this really near death experience that really had a tremendous impact on my life. And as a result of that, I ended up exiting against the stream about a year before all of the kind of maniac chaos stuff that has gone down recently. Me and
Mhm.
my wife Shannon exited that kind of community, and we sort of headed for the hills out here in Colorado. And almost dying. The thing about it that I could say briefly is that it gave me a massive reprioritizing of my values. And it was just like, if it all can end so quickly, all of a sudden there was so much stuff I was doing. I'm like, why am I doing all this stuff that doesn't fulfill me? And so, we moved out to Colorado where my parents live. We bought 7 acres of land. We have donkeys and chickens and fruit trees, and we had a baby last year. We built this big house. So we have this sort of crazy Colorado lifestyle right now. And now I'm just sort of, integrating my work and my Dharma practice and my teaching and all things, trying to do it from a very rural location, which is challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for the catch up on that. And that's been quite a lot in the past couple of years. Not a lot of folks can say, well, there was that almost dying part and then moving, and we've had a kid, and just completely changed how things worked in the group I've been with for years. That kind of went south. Although I sympathize having that happen to myself with my own group at the Center for Mindfulness falling apart last year. So yeah, I get it. And you're thriving from what I'm seeing. And that's really what I want to talk about is some of the stuff that you have been working on and you and Shannon founded. Maybe we can dive right into Secular Dharma Foundation. Tell us about that.
The Secular Dharma Foundation is, it's a mixture of secular practices and Dharma practices. And kind of a lot of it is the stuff that you've been, spearheading for a decade now, probably. But one thing about it that's been interesting for me that kind of made me land in this camp, and you probably know this about me, is like I used to have this black and white thinking of like, I'm going to be a secular mindfulness guy. Then I'm like, no, 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 secular mindfulness is bad. I'm going to be just a straight Dharma guy. And then I'm like, no, Dharma's too limited. I'm going to be. So I kept going back and forth.
Yeah.
I couldn't get out of the dichotomy of one or the other.
Hmm.
And so because I've done a lot of clinical work and a lot of secular work and therapy and addiction treatment, and I teach Dharma retreats, I just kind of got to this point of I just need to bring these two worlds together.
Yeah.
And I always had a resistance towards the secular Buddhism thing, just because the word Buddhism is uncomfortable for me. It always has been. The word Dharma has never been a problem for me. It's just I actually feel very connected, and I have a strong sense of spirituality towards the word Dharma. And then even working with Stephen Batcher a little bit over the years, he's using secular Dharma now. So
Right.
it's just a way of how can we actually best support people in the arena of psychological well-being, emotional well-being, by utilizing all of the secular practices here, secular meaning the stuff that's available to us today, through emotional science, through therapy, through clinical research. How can we use what my friend Eve Ekman calls Western contemplative traditions
Yep.
and Eastern contemplative traditions in a way that's integrated? And I've always wanted to do that. And we're just now starting to get it off the ground. We started it a couple years ago. We got the 501c. And then I worked at this organization, Mindful Schools, briefly. And I was just doing a lot of other stuff. And we're finally now getting it off the ground. We have some retreats scheduled this year. But really, it's a integration of these two things of saying that, early Buddhist tradition, lots of great things, some limitations. Secular practices, therapy, psychological practices, a lot of it very good, but also limited. So
Yeah.
we're just trying to use the best of both worlds to give people a framework that gets away of some of the associative baggage that comes with things like Buddhism and some of these other things that make people feel reluctant to even enter something like that.
Yeah. Interesting. And I know you've got some other folks that have been working on that with you that I think are on your board. You mentioned Eve Ekman is on there, and I think Hanuman Goldman, another mutual friend that we've got, is one of the other folks. And it's just neat seeing the people that you've collected working on this. That yeah, this is a really good group to be having that mix and this, I think what you're doing, respectful intersectionality of Dharma and contemporary, more secular practices, that these don't have to be in conflict. They can be quite complementary, mutually supportive. And of course, that's what we do here with secular Buddhism. And and yet, when we're in environments where, I've talked about this before, and particularly with your previous work at Mindful Schools, it needs to not be Buddhism. It needs to be truly secular and about mindfulness and science and about how human neurology is. So you got the experience that a lot of people don't have of navigating that nuance of, okay, when is it this and when is it the other thing? And not everyone's going to get that. Some people have a hard time with it. My One of my board members and I got into a tussle with someone who was very aggressively coming at us on one of the social media places, just very antagonistic towards secular Buddhism without really asking about it, without really understanding we're doing something different and we're not being disrespectful. We're intentionally not co-opting what's of a much deeper meaning to you in different ways than it is because it's in your culture and it's not in mine. And we want to honor that and respect that. And it just would go nowhere. So sometimes that's going to happen too.
Yeah.
So, what are the kinds of things that you're doing with that? I think you've got some retreats and classes, and catch us up on that too.
Yeah, the big thing is, and a lot of it is getting off the ground right now. We're happy to say we have a couple retreats actually on the schedule this year, which is great. So talking about the retreat format is, I'm a Theravadan sort of insight trained IMS sort of. I teach those kinds of retreats, and I think there's tremendous value in the 10-day Vipassana silent retreat, and I sit those all the time. I teach those, and I think they're great. But I think there's parts of it that's limited. So one of the things that I bring into the retreat model is science of emotion, and understanding that early Buddhism and actually Dharma practice and Buddhism in general doesn't do a very good job of talking about emotions. There's
Right.
no Pali, Tibetan, Chinese, Sanskrit term that means anything like emotion. And people obviously struggle with their emotions.
Yeah.
And a lot of times emotions don't come up on retreat because you're eliminating all the emotional triggers. You're not making eye contact, you're not talking. One of the biggest emotional triggers is other people. So what we do is we do a little bit of education in the afternoon on science of emotion, and we do like some insight dialogue, Gregory Kramer stuff, where people talk back and forth in a very kind of, for lack of a better word, controlled environment, where we can actually talk about some of this stuff. And then in the evening, instead of doing your traditional Dharma talk, we do a big 90-minute session on Brahma Vihara heart practices. So we really structure this sort of three models in the day. There's early morning to lunch, which is just the cultivation of mindfulness practices in silence, sitting, walking. There's this afternoon session, which is we open up the container a little bit and we do some teaching, and people do some small group work and some dialogue. They go back into silence for dinner, and then they come back in for the evening session, which is, loving kindness, compassion, forgiveness, appreciation, gratitude, equanimity, these practices, because the hope is that as they get stirred up a little bit in the afternoon with emotions, then they have this evening time to actually cultivate some practices to really get into that territory. And then we kind of close the day with some dialogue or some Q&A of like, hey, how was that for you? So you still get, it feels like an insight retreat because there is a lot of silence, but opening the container a little bit and letting people do this kind of work is what I say is now you're opening into the emotional world and also the relational world. So they're feeling emotions, they're relating them to other people, they're doing it in a safe context, they're doing it with people who are trained and educated in this stuff. So that's kind of the model that I've been developing and working with. Um, and so we're really excited to do it this year. We have two right now that are on the schedule.
Nice. And yeah, as I look at the schedule, just for people who are more curious about this, and of course, I'll provide this link on the episode page, seculardharmafoundation.com. If you don't go to the episode page, you're just listening to it on iTunes, that's the address. And on your courses, events, and retreats, by the time this goes out, you'll be finished with the February thing you have coming out. But you have something coming out in April and something else in June. So you do have a couple things. So for those of you who are listening, who are more interested, you can find out more on that website again, seculardharmafoundation.com. And you got some other things cooking too, I think. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what else you've been working on?
Well, part of it again is, let's you know, dare we venture into the territory talking about mindfulness now? But I guess we got to talk about mindfulness a little bit. You know, mindfulness. You know, everybody thinks they know what it means, and that seems to be part of the problem.
Yep.
You know, and you know, and maybe that's why it's good, is the ambiguity of it. But again, as somebody who has at times been a staunch satipatthana, direct path to liberation, satipatthana is the only way. I've
Yeah.
totally I've been in that before. You know, I asked for forgiveness for times of which I was inclined in that way.
I knew
And
you'd get there. That's okay.
you know, but it's just I think it's actually really healthy to
Yeah.
have views and to let them go and to move. And so um I also find that for a lot of people, you know, sort of, I guess we could say, in the Theravada insight world, the insight tradition world, Satipatthana has sort of been the Bible for the last 10 years, with the work of Bhikkhu Analayo, which has been tremendously useful
Hmm.
work, but it's sort of the Bible of insight meditation. And it doesn't translate well to the everyday folk. The terminology is counterintuitive. A lot of it doesn't make sense. Um, it's not user friendly from the right out of the gate, I don't find. And you know, it uses words like mindfulness of mind. What the hell does that mean? Feeling, which Veda know, which is useful, but we associate feeling with emotion.
Right.
And I've gotten really tired of trying to translate it to people in a way that made sense. And I was like, I'm just gonna teach it easy. So what I've done is I have a secular mindfulness course that I've been working on for, you know, 10 years basically, um, where I'm really trying to. Here's the other thing too about the insight tradition that I think is problematic is a lot of the students I work with, a lot of people that I talk to have been practicing for years. Everybody seems to get stuck on mindfulness of breathing. You know, it's like I know people that have been doing it for 10 years, and everybody wants to know where it's going. And when it gets into the third and fourth foundation, it gets too complicated. That, you know, when we look at it from a secular sense, we could say that I basically categorize mindfulness in four components. That we have the somatic component of the body, which includes the five senses and the nervous system. We also have the cognitive component of mindfulness, which is the mind and the cognitive function and metacognitive awareness and all the ways in which we can actually observe the internal workings of the mind. And so that sort of mind body, which is kind of where mindfulness has been limited, is mind body problem. And then, as I mentioned about my retreats, I also have the component of the emotional component. How do we bring mindfulness into the messy and beautiful world of emotions? And then also there's a relational component, that a lot of that was inspired by my friend Deborah Eden Tull, who has a book called Relational Mindfulness. How do we actually be mindful and practice mindfulness in dialogue? And a lot of these emotional and relational components are mindfulness practices that are really done off the cushion. These are mindfulness practices that can be done on the go, which is pretty much where we are most of the time anyway.
Right. Not most of our time on the cushion, and that's really where the rubber hits the road. Is it's not just about I clocked my time today on the cushion, go me. It's but if you're still running into the same problems, that's not what the important thing is. How is it changing you? How are you when you're out with others or when
Right.
you're just by yourself and it's not formal meditation time? How is this influencing your life?
And of course, there's a big dichotomy that has been created, no fault of anybody's, but people have their Dharma or their mindfulness practice is one thing, and then their life is something else.
Yeah.
And they have a hard time integrating them. You know, I've had that experience. People talk about it all the time. They go sit a 10-day retreat, they go on an insight retreat, they have these profound changes, they have these wonderful insights. And then they go back out to the world and they get triggered and they get emotional and they have
Right.
conflicts in their relationships. And they're like, well, how do I take this thing I'm learning in retreat to the rest of my life? And
Mhm.
so there's a way to do that. And then there's also a way to acknowledge that you sort of can't do that. I mean, retreat is a very privileged kind of
Yeah,
experience.
it's a unique environment. This is, and it's always interesting when people say, "Oh, I feel so great. I had this wonderful time. I'm going to stop taking my meds and I'm just going to like, whoa, hang on."
Yeah.
It's like when you go on vacation to a great place. Oh, I want to move here. This is great. Like, this is great because you weren't working and you were
No,
in a
I know.
different place that's beautiful. When you get
Totally.
back to your regular world, what's it going to be like then? That's
Yeah.
really what we would hope is a positive influence of the practice that you're doing when you're on retreat or on vacation or wherever you're going.
Right. So yeah, exactly. So the way that I've structured the secular mindfulness course is really in these four categories. So there's, sort of mind, body, emotion, relation. But I use the word somatic and cognitive because they're a little bit, especially in all the work of people like Peter Levine and all the work around trauma. People think of the body. When we think of the body, we don't actually respect the complexity of what the body is.
Right.
It's really the somatic experience.
Hmm.
It's the nerve and people, the buzzword nowadays, and especially in the clinical world, self-regulation, 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 mindfulness and self-regulation. But that's really a somatic based skill. So I also try to outline that there's skills that need to be developed in each component. So like, for example, in the somatic component of mindfulness, the skills are focused attention, self-regulation, and I take a page from Shinzen Young and I use sensory clarity. So those are the skills you develop there. They don't translate necessarily into all of the rest of them, but those are the foundational. And then when I get into the cognitive component, we're dealing with metacognitive awareness, cognitive resilience, and then sustained mindfulness. This short moments repeated become continuous. The classic, you know, uh, I always forget his name, uh, Viktor Frankl, you
Yeah.
know, increasing the gap between stimulus and response.
Right.
And actually, in a sort of third noble truth way, expanding the gap so wide that you actually start living there.
Right. Right.
You can do that.
Yeah. And it takes practice, and
Yeah, and a
it's
lot of
not
practice.
always just a here is the one way. I mean, this is one of the stumbling blocks I have in some articulations of practice is this is the one way that truly leads and absolutely leads. Like, not necessarily. That assumes everyone's the same, and they're not. Just today there was an article I found on, it was some psychology journal article about research, and it was saying, yeah, but it's not like mindfulness has any side effects or that it could hurt anybody. And I'm like, whoa, hang on,
Yeah,
it's not right for everybody at the same time. And I had just my other podcast than this one, recorded an interview with my old friend Willoughby Britton, who has studied
yeah,
exactly that, the problems that occur from it, and can
right.
for some. We need to be aware of that.
Especially with trauma. I mean, I've worked in prisons and treatment centers. I've seen so many people get dysregulated, and I've seen the opposite of self-regulation. Is that mindfulness isn't for everybody, or maybe it's not that. It's not that it's not for everybody. It's just when are they being introduced to the practice?
Yeah, what's
It's
the right
not the right
time for it?
time. Yeah,
Yep.
it's not the right
Yep.
time. It's like this dude ain't ready to be inside his experience.
Right.
Yeah, so I feel like,
Yeah, and in courses where teachers who've been well trained, and you grew up with this, I mean, you're really steep and it's deep in your bones, and others who have had lots and lots of training and lots of practice, there can still be those who aren't quite as aware that there are ways in which we can adjust just a little bit what we're doing to ensure that for the people who are in our classes and our retreats, there are going to be people there who have trauma, as an example. And there are small things we can do to still have this practice work for them. I was speaking with someone this morning who was saying, I've been trying meditation and I get anxious every time I try it. What are you doing? I'm doing, when they describe a particular practice, we're out here to knock on any one thing. Like, okay, have you tried this other stuff? Let's try something now and just pay attention to how you're feeling. And sure enough, it's, this particular thing wasn't right for you, but that's been held up as here's the one way you got to do this. And they
right.
bought that. And it's not always so. We do need to respect the individual experiences of people.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. One thing that I've really been doing in the last couple of years that I've really loved doing is I have a mindfulness mentoring program where I work with people basically once a month, and it's one of the things that I really like. I have a small list of students. Many of them have been with me for 2 or 3 years now, but part of it as a teacher is just like having. I think that there's a way in which of course, everybody wants to be a mindfulness teacher now, which is a whole nother problem we could talk about some other time. But actually, like not making assumptions about what people need,
Right,
and
right,
like what works. Is actually like we really have to respect our own and other people's subjective experience. And I usually start everybody out with the basic stuff, but then it changes really quickly. And I have 20 people who are doing 20 different things all the time for different reasons. And it's really forced me, and that's why I'm so interested in the work that Stephen Batcher's been doing all this years. I find myself having to rethink this whole thing a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, oh, gee, I thought I had it. And I'm like, no, I need to, I'm always finding myself having to rethink this whole thing. And which to me is just an ongoing practice of right view. And I feel like that's a healthy thing because we're very early on, obviously. And I think there's a way we really just have to. That's why I like the secular Dharma stuff again is we use a lot of the therapeutic stuff. And one of the things that's really important to people is having an ongoing therapeutic relationship with somebody or the practice where you're staying with somebody long enough that you're not, the problem with these insight retreats sometimes is you have a 10-minute interview with somebody
Yeah.
with somebody that you've never known. I mean, how much do you think you're going to get accomplished?
Right. And that person that is interviewing you may have no clinical experience whatsoever, or might not have some idea about how to work with someone who it's not existential suffering, it's trauma.
Right. Yeah, that's
And
right.
they're not here for enlightenment. They're here because their standard coping mechanisms aren't working.
Right.
And
And their
that may be
body
a
is,
different thing.
yeah, their body is like injured,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
I mean, they've done a lot better job than that. I mean, they're starting a lot of these insight retreats. They're making sure that somebody on the team has been, people are addressing this reality, and I think in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
But it's just again having to rethink this of like, oh, maybe this isn't good for everybody, and maybe we shouldn't let everybody into the 3-month retreat. Maybe everybody doesn't need to do that, and
Right.
so there's just an ongoing way in which I think questioning what works and what doesn't work is something that I've just find myself uh, just overwhelmed at times. I'm like, God, like I'm never going to figure this out.
Yeah. And that's why we'll never be bored.
No,
We're
right?
in a fascinating field.
Hmm.
So, Dave, what else about Secular Dharma Foundation or the work that you're doing do you want to share with the listeners before I let you go?
Um, well, we're getting ready to do a bunch of stuff, so we're still in the early stages. But part of it is, we kind of really work in 4 domains. It's kind of the way that we have things packaged. Is that we teach and we practice and we educate around mindfulness skills. So we do a lot of mindfulness training, mindfulness classes, anything mindfulness. But we also do respect both traditions. We say, well, here, the Buddhist tradition says this, and the scientists say this, and you can figure it out for your own. But for me, it's always rooted in this ehipassiko idea of like, come and
Come.
have a look. I'm
Yeah.
not assuming I know what's right for you, what's not right for you, or what's wrong for you, but let's just have a look. So, really, a tremendous respect for the first person empirical, data that people get of mindfulness practice. So, trying to reconfigure it in a way that really is as comprehensive and also simple without trying to make it complicated. The other domain is emotional intelligence. One thing that I've noticed in sort of my thesis, I do this lecture around the country. I've probably given this lecture 15 times now around the country, what I call the war on emotions. And, I think as a culture and a society, we have sort of declared a war against difficult emotions and
Right.
feelings that we don't want to feel. And the pharmacology industry is not the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is because of this phenomenon. And mindfulness is guilty of this too, of just be mindful and everything's going to work out. So, a lot of the stuff I pull is the stuff that I learned years ago, a lot of the Daniel Goleman stuff, understanding that emotional intelligence is comprehensive. There's different skills and different competencies. And then, of course, working with Eve Ekman, now that I'm coming back around, I'm really bringing in universal emotions, science of emotions. So a lot of our work is just like public service announcement of like,
Yeah.
hey, you have these emotions and it's like they're not going anywhere. And so the gap is letting people know that actually the best vehicle, the great vehicle to navigate the world of emotion turns out to be mindfulness. And so one of the things that I oftentimes question people who are all pro mindfulness and mindfulness is so great, a lot of times my pushback is, well, why? Why should I be mindful? For what reason should I develop mindfulness? And I rarely get anything but a clumsy answer.
Because it's a question that is not one that comes in this often scripted educational constraints they've been given. And I find the same thing in some Dharma teachers, where if you ask a question about, can you say this without using Pali or Sanskrit? Can you use your own words and tell me what that means to me when my kid gets hit by a car or some horrible thing? Tell me how this works then. And often there's a loss because it's, I'm going to give this Dharma talk and this thing I know real well. Like, yeah, but that's kind of separated from my lived reality right in this moment.
That's right. That's right. And that's why I think, Buddhism has also declared a war against suffering. The end of suffering, this, I think it's really a big problem. I think it's a bypass. It's a spiritual bypass. It's not ending suffering. It's actually learning to live in a world that is suffering.
Yeah, it's
And a,
disconnect. There's a disconnection from everything, a rejection of everything, and that's just so different, interestingly, from what we often do with mindfulness, which is turning towards.
right. So a lot of it is really using these skills to really help people, give them a really kind of a good framework for the possibilities and also the limitations.
Yeah, yeah,
That's kind of the thing that I'm always trying to point is like, here's the possibilities, here's the limitations. It's not going to solve all your problems. It's going to be helpful. And so a lot of that is just really letting people build that. And so in like cultivating emotional balance, for example, that world, I mean, emotions is actually the path to eudaimonia, the path to genuine
yeah,
happiness,
yeah.
the path to a meaningful life is actually through the emotional door, where we're not learning to indulge the emotion or suppress the emotion. So here we have a middle way of respecting them and actually taking it on as a challenge of like, okay, I'm actually going to start taking responsibility for my emotional life and the destructive behaviors and the outcomes and the way in which my emotions are causing me suffering in the many ways that I'm probably in denial about that.
Yeah.
So, these two, of course, we could go on, but so those are the two kind of skills. And then mostly we've been focusing on substance abuse because I have a tremendous background in that, trauma, in mental health. So sort of that mental health clinical world, a little bit education now. But as somebody, if you look, at addiction in our society, it's getting worse, not better. We've made all these advancements, and if you look at the clinical research, everybody's talking about, oh, there's all these advancements in trauma. There's all these great mindfulness-based cognitive therapies, DBTs. There's a whole list of MBIs. But actually, if you look at the numbers, we're not doing any better helping people than we were 40, 50, 60 years ago. So if we have all these wonderful advancements in addiction therapy and addiction psychology, addiction treatment, and and we're still dealing with the crappy numbers we were getting in the 50s and the 60s, what is going on there?
I actually have an answer to that because this is, as you know, this is part of what I do for a living. Part of it is we're getting better at reporting, so we're seeing greater reporting of incidents. So, for example, we may see, oh, there's just this huge increase in kids with ADHD. I'm like, no, there's a huge increase in the numbers of diagnosis we're doing because we didn't have the proper diagnosis tools before. It
We
doesn't
have
mean
more
there's
awareness.
more of them, there's more awareness. So I suggest a couple things. First is, yeah, addiction numbers and substance abuse may be going up. And what's a big contributor to that? The opioid crisis. We didn't
Sure.
have that in the 50s. So
True.
there's other stuff that has come up that has bumped those numbers up. But in how we're working with things like alcohol, still a big problem. And people are still going to programs that, if you look at the metrics, don't actually work as treatment programs. So there's that. I think you're right. We're seeing increased rates of suicide. We're also seeing increased diagnosis of depression and anxiety. And when we look at individual programs that work with those, like CBT, things like that, we see that, yes, there is some efficacy to those. But of course, when you put that against and our increased
Exactly.
numbers of people who have it, are like, yeah, it looks like nothing's happening. It is. It's just, are we getting those people into treatment? And this is one of the things I'm encouraged by is that part of that increased awareness of that is mental illness is becoming less stigmatized in our
That's
society
true.
than it has been. It's still a very big problem, and it's still very much a problem for people who suffer from mental illness because there's more acceptance in regular society doesn't mean it's easier to
No, it's
face,
not easier.
especially as someone who has it.
It's funny.
And
What you just talked about for the last couple of minutes was a really great teaching of dependent origination. You
Yeah.
know, you're like,
Hey,
well,
that was my plan all along. I swear I planned it.
the number, you're totally right. I mean, you're totally right. So it's almost impossible to measure.
Yeah.
And also, I think the big problem is, and this is a whole political thing I don't want to get into, it's that people just don't have access to, there, nobody has access to EMDR. Nobody has access to there's all these great clinical interventions, but people who have drug problems, they don't have $50,000 saved
Right.
up so they can go do, for $15,000 worth of trauma therapy. So
Right.
people don't have access. So, part of what we're trying to do in Secular Dharma Foundation on one of the reasons why we want to raise funds is, and one of the reasons why I'm trying to come up with these, mindfulness-based emotional skills training, is trying to give people a bite-sized intervention. So you got this guy, he's been in a treatment for, and I have a program in California, multi-concept recovery, that was started by my friends that are actually using the Secular Dharma Foundation curriculum, and they're actually seeing really good numbers with it. But it's like, guys on day 4 in treatment, and he's a total mess. What can we give him? What mindfulness, emotional, what's the thing that we can give him that's going to actually have a profound, or at least a subtle improvement on the quality of his experience? And what I found that works is the education of emotions. When people get some education on emotions, they're like, you mean it's not my fault? And you mean everybody has these? And it calms everybody down when they start to realize what emotions are. And then
Normalize the experience.
you normalize the experience, and then you give them a couple of little simple mindfulness practices that are nothing profound: body breath awareness, you know sensory opening to sound and ringing bells. You don't have to give them much.
Yeah.
And then people, they start to realize there's a doorway opening. Oh,
Right.
there's another way of operating in the world.
And in that way,
So
profoundly transformative to them, because it's totally a different way of looking at things.
that's right. I take a page from the systems theories people, is that one little subtle, and we know this about, it's like a lot of people know this, is that, and we know this in the Dharma world, like one little change over here, it can have profound results over here. So my question, and sort of my obsession, if you will, over the last decade is how what's the bite size, what's the most efficient, pragmatic thing that people can kind of get that just kind of starts to foster that, and so, I'm sort of back to the Johnny Appleseed mentality. If I just want to, you know get as much of this out there as I can, because I don't think, um, the good news here, and maybe it's taken me a long time to say it, is that I don't think what the Buddha was teaching was very complicated at all. I don't think that mindfulness is very complicated at all. I don't think that the skills that you need to have a meaningful, happy life, I don't think they're complicated skills. I really don't. I think all of this stuff is very, very simple. And I think that, Buddhism has done a sort of bad job of elevating, enlightenment and all that stuff to being this unachievable thing.
Right.
And, mindfulness has done that a little bit, but I really try to, install the idea in people's minds that this is not, you can do this,
Right.
and you can
Right.
start right now. Like
Yeah.
you do, you say this thing at the end of your podcast about every moment there's a choice. I've been hearing you say that for years, man.
Yeah. Make the
I don't know
best
if
you
you still
can.
do,
Yeah.
but
Every episode of both podcasts ends that way.
I love that, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. And one choice can change the complete, total trajectory of your life.
Yeah. And what's really nice about that is, and this took me a really long time in my life to get to a point of realizing that there wasn't actually a momentum of my thought and my past. That, sure, it creates the conditions for this moment. But if I had bad choices up to now, doesn't matter how many decades of bad choices I've been making, right now, I can make a different choice. And even if I kind of mess this one up or it doesn't go quite as planned, that next moment, here's a whole nother opportunity to still make another choice. And that's the power of that, is that you shift the thoughts, which have no weight, they have no mass, they can turn on a dime. Let's make that more helpful to us and make a different choice.
And that is a very, very encouraging idea. That's to me, I'm just like, I feel very encouraged by that idea. And it's interesting, like in the emotional work, emotional intelligence, and the cultivating emotional balance work, that's what, awareness plus choice equals freedom. It's all about being able to actually follow through with the choices and the intentions that you have, which turns out to not be necessarily that easy.
Yeah.
But what we're
Yeah.
going up against, like you said, the momentum, what we're going up against, I don't think is, it's the mind and suffering and all this stuff. It's kind of been turned into a boogeyman.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be this, impossible. Just thinking of the boogeyman. It's not Michael Myers.
Right.
You don't have to beat up Michael Myers with one punch all at once. You can do little things at a time.
Yeah, it's more like Yosemite Sam.
Yeah, you can be, yeah, it could be like that. It could be much, much easier. It doesn't need to be a gigantic thing. And that's really what makes it so hard is we made Buddhism enlightenment this thing that's so hard. You want to go, okay, so how about just right now, I'm going to take a few breaths or
Right.
listen to sounds. If breathing isn't the right focus for you or something else, just that is the start. You don't need to do more than that right now.
Yeah. And that's sort of, been my, as somebody who studied this stuff, I put it on the pedestal. I've been constantly taking this idea of awakening on and off the pedestal for 25 years now. Currently, I have it off the pedestal, and I'd like to keep it that way.
Well, so our guest today has been Dave Smith. You can find out more about what he is doing at seculardharmafoundation.com. Dave, thanks for being here. Good to talk with you.
Yeah, you too, Ted. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.